The rumble of the moving truck echoed through the quiet streets of Harmony Haven, a suburban neighborhood nestled in Charlotte, North Carolina. 13-year-old Sarah Jackson pressed her face against the window of the family's aging sedan, her bright eyes scanning the tree-lined avenue. She could see rows of pastel-colored houses with neatly trimmed lawns. But what struck her most was the silence, eerily perfect, like a photograph frozen in time. Her parents, Marcus and Angela Jackson, sat in the front, exchanging uneasy glances. This move was supposed to be their fresh start, but both felt the unspoken tension of being one of the few African-American families in an otherwise predominantly white neighborhood. "Sarah, sweetheart, this is home now," her mother said, turning around to offer a reassuring smile. But Sarah could hear the doubt in her voice. As the days passed, the Jacksons' excitement about their new home waned. The neighbors were polite but distant, their smiles thin and fleeting. Sarah overheard whispers at the bus stop and felt the weight of curious stares at school. Some kids were friendly, but others made snide remarks that she didn't quite understand yet, half-hidden barbs about her clothes, her hair, her place in this neighborhood. Marcus and Angela worked long hours at a nearby grocery store they had invested in, leaving Sarah to navigate this unfamiliar world alone after school. Despite her sunny demeanor, loneliness crept in, and the pristine facade of Harmony Haven began to feel like a cage. It was during one of her solitary afternoons that Sarah first noticed Mrs. Eleanor. The elderly woman strolled slowly down the sidewalk, leaning on an intricately carved wooden cane. Her white hair, pulled back into a bun, gleamed in the late afternoon sun. She wore a simple floral dress and carried a wicker basket overflowing with fresh vegetables. Mrs. Eleanor's presence seemed to radiate a quiet warmth, so different from the cold detachment Sarah had felt from others in the neighborhood. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Sarah called out, her voice bright and clear. Mrs. Eleanor stopped and turned, her weathered face breaking into a kind smile. "Well, good afternoon to you, young lady," she replied. "What's your name?" "Sarah. We just moved into the blue house on the corner," she said, pointing toward her home. "Welcome to Harmony Haven, Sarah," Mrs. Eleanor said. "It's not often we get such polite new faces around here." Despite the warmth of their first interaction, not everyone was as welcoming as Mrs. Eleanor. Mr. Finch, a stern man in his 50s who lived 2 houses down, eyed the Jacksons with suspicion. He often stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching Sarah and her parents as if waiting for them to step out of line. "Watch yourself, Sarah," her mother warned one evening. "Not everyone here is going to like us, no matter how hard we try." Sarah didn't fully understand her mother's caution but nodded all the same. She decided to focus on the things that brought her joy, like the books she loved to read and the small adventures she created in the backyard. One afternoon, as Sarah returned home from school, she found a small basket on their porch. It was filled with freshly picked vegetables, tomatoes, zucchini, and bright green bell peppers. Tucked between them was a note written in elegant cursive, "Welcome to the neighborhood." From Mrs. Eleanor. Sarah beamed and ran inside to show her parents. "See, not everyone's bad," she said, her optimism unshaken. Her father chuckled, but her mother's smile was tinged with caution. "That's sweet, honey," Angela said, "but just be careful, okay?" The following day, Sarah decided to visit Mrs. Eleanor to thank her personally. She found the older woman tending to a small garden behind her modest home. "Mrs. Eleanor, thank you for the vegetables," Sarah said, holding up the empty basket. Mrs. Eleanor straightened up slowly, her movements deliberate and careful. "You're very welcome, Sarah. I figured you could use some fresh produce. The grocery stores these days charge an arm and a leg." Over the next hour, the two talked, and Sarah learned that Mrs. Eleanor lived alone. Her husband had passed away years ago, and she had no children. Sarah listened intently, fascinated by Mrs. Eleanor's stories of her younger days. "It must get lonely," Sarah said softly, her young face full of empathy. Mrs. Eleanor smiled, her eyes distant. "Sometimes, yes, but loneliness teaches you to appreciate the little things, like new friends." The growing bond between Sarah and Mrs. Eleanor did not go unnoticed. Mr. Finch and a few other neighbors began whispering about the Jacksons' motives. Their conversations laced with suspicion and prejudice. "They're just taking advantage of an old lady," Mr. Finch muttered to a group at the local diner. "Mark my words, Something's not right. Sarah, oblivious to the brewing tension, continued visiting Mrs. Eleanor every afternoon. But her parents, especially her mother, began to sense that their presence in Harmony Haven was stirring more than just casual curiosity. One evening, as Sarah returned from Mrs. Eleanor's house, she saw Mr. Finch standing by her front gate. His arms were crossed, and his expression was severe. He didn't say a word but followed her with his eyes as she walked inside. "Who was that man?" Sarah asked her mother after closing the door. Angela's face darkened. "Someone who doesn't want us here," she said grimly. "Stay away from him." Sarah, unbeknownst to Sarah, her simple friendship with Mrs. Eleanor was about to unravel a web of secrets, prejudices, and unexpected twists that would change all their lives forever. The warm scent of freshly tilled soil and blooming flowers greeted Sarah as she entered Mrs. Eleanor's backyard. The elderly woman, her back slightly hunched but her spirit strong, was meticulously planting rows of carrots. The garden wasn't large, but it was vibrant, filled with life and color. "Need some help, Mrs. Eleanor?" Sarah asked, setting her school bag on the porch. Mrs. Eleanor chuckled, brushing dirt from her hands. "I won't say no to an extra set of hands. Grab that trowel over there." Sarah knelt beside her and began working. The older woman's movements were deliberate, as if each turn of the soil held meaning. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the hum of bees and chirping birds filling the air. As they worked, Mrs. Eleanor began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of memories. "This garden's been my refuge since I moved here. Grew it all myself. When my husband passed, it became my way of finding peace." Sarah looked up, her hands paused mid-dig. "Did you have any kids?" she asked hesitantly. Mrs. Eleanor shook her head. "No, child, we wanted to, but life had other plans. Instead, I put my energy into work." Her eyes softened. "I used to run a business. You know, back in Chicago." Sarah's curiosity was piqued. "What kind of business?" "Rice," Mrs. Eleanor said simply. Who would have thought? A black woman in the 1960s, making her mark in the grain industry. It wasn't easy. People didn't think someone like me belonged in boardrooms. Sarah was captivated. "How did you do it?" "With grit, smarts, and a stubborn refusal to back down," Mrs. Eleanor said, her tone firm. "But it came at a cost. Friends, family, even my peace of mind." Their conversations became a daily ritual. After school, Sarah would rush over to help in the garden or sit on the porch with lemonade as Mrs. Eleanor shared more about her life. She spoke of victories and betrayals, of dreams that soared and others that shattered. Through these stories, Sarah began to see Mrs. Eleanor not just as a kind old neighbor but as a woman of extraordinary strength and complexity. In turn, Sarah opened up about her own struggles. She spoke of the teasing at school, of the way some neighbors avoided her family. "Sometimes I wish I could just be invisible," she admitted one afternoon. Mrs. Eleanor reached over and squeezed her hand. "Never let anyone dim your light, Sarah. The world's full of people who'll try, but you've got to keep shining." Unbeknownst to Sarah, her frequent visits were stirring resentment. Mr. Finch, always quick to judge, began spreading rumors. "You see how that girl's always at Eleanor's place? Mark my words, they're up to something," he said to a group of neighbors. His words sowed seeds of doubt in the community. Some began to question why Mrs. Eleanor, who had lived quietly for years, suddenly seemed so close to the new family. One afternoon, as Sarah was leaving Mrs. Eleanor's house, she overheard two women whispering on the sidewalk. "She's just using her," one said. "I heard her parents are struggling. Maybe they're trying to get something out of Eleanor." The other replied. Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. But she kept walking, clutching her backpack tightly. She didn't tell her parents what she'd heard, not wanting to worry them. One evening, after dinner, Sarah found Mrs. Eleanor waiting on their porch. In her hands was a small wooden box, worn but beautifully carved. "This is for you, Sarah," she said, her voice warm but serious. Sarah opened the box to find a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a key. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed. "But why are you giving it to me?" "Because you remind me of myself when I was your age," Mrs. Eleanor said, her eyes glistening. "This key is a symbol of something important. It's about unlocking doors people may try to keep closed to you." Sarah put the necklace on immediately, feeling its cool weight against her skin. "I'll take good care of it," she promised. Despite the joy Sarah felt from her bond with Mrs. Eleanor, the whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. Mr. Finch became more vocal in his accusations. At a neighborhood association meeting, he openly questioned the Jacksons' intentions. Eleanor's been living here for years without anyone bothering her, he said. Now this family moves in, and suddenly they're best friends? It doesn't add up. Angela and Marcus heard about the meeting and debated whether to confront the issue. We're not here to cause trouble, Marcus said, but I won't let anyone slander our family. As the days turned into weeks, the divide in the neighborhood became more pronounced. Some residents admired Sarah's kindness and viewed the friendship as genuine, while others, fueled by Mr. Finch's suspicions, grew wary. One afternoon, Sarah noticed a shadow in Mrs. Eleanor's garden as they worked. Looking up, she saw Mr. Finch standing on the sidewalk, his expression unreadable. Don't mind him, Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice steady. Some people can't see past their own bitterness. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their friendship was becoming a lightning rod for something much bigger and much darker. That evening, as Sarah walked home, she found a crumpled piece of paper stuffed in their mailbox. It was an anonymous note, scrawled in harsh, jagged letters. Stay away from the old lady if you know what's good for you. Sarah's hands trembled as she showed the note to her parents. Her father's jaw tightened, and her mother's face filled with worry. This isn't just about us anymore, Angela said softly. It's about Eleanor, too. And for the first time, Sarah realized that their bond with Mrs. Eleanor wasn't just a source of joy. It was a spark that could ignite something far more dangerous. The rain fell in steady drizzles, soft against the windows of Mrs. Eleanor's cozy living room. Sarah sat cross-legged on the plush rug, carefully sorting through an old chest of belongings Mrs. Eleanor had asked her to bring down from the attic. Inside, Sarah found a stack of weathered letters tied with a faded red ribbon. Each envelope was marked with the same Chicago address, their edges worn from years of handling. Curious, she glanced at Mrs. Eleanor, who was sitting in her favorite armchair, wrapped in a knitted shawl. What are these? Sarah asked, holding up the bundle. Mrs. Eleanor's face softened with a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. Those letters are from a time when I was someone else, she said cryptically. Before Harmony Haven, before this quiet life. Sarah hesitated, not wanting to pry, but Mrs. Eleanor gestured for her to open one. The letter inside was written in bold, confident handwriting. As Sarah began to read, Mrs. Eleanor's story unfolded. The letters revealed a younger Eleanor, determined, sharp, and ambitious, building her career in Chicago's competitive grain trade during the 1960s. She had founded a small company specializing in importing and exporting rice, a business dominated by white men who dismissed her efforts at every turn. Eleanor fought battles on multiple fronts: racism, sexism, and the constant doubt of those around her. They used to call me Little Lady in meetings, Mrs. Eleanor recounted, her voice tinged with both pride and bitterness. I proved them wrong, every time. Sarah listened intently, her admiration for Mrs. Eleanor growing. But the letters also hinted at betrayal. One letter in particular stood out, a terse note from a former business partner who had stolen trade secrets and nearly bankrupted her company. Is that why you left? Sarah asked, her voice quiet. Mrs. Eleanor nodded. That, and other things. Chicago was a battlefield, and I got tired of fighting. Harmony Haven was my retreat, a place to heal. Hearing Mrs. Eleanor's story gave Sarah a newfound perspective on her own struggles at school. The taunts she endured from classmates suddenly felt smaller in comparison to the battles Mrs. Eleanor had fought. Do you ever wish you'd done things differently? Sarah asked one afternoon as they tended to the garden. Mrs. Eleanor's gaze was steady. Every choice I made brought me here. To this garden, to this life, and now, to you. I don't regret a thing. Sarah carried those words with her like a talisman, a shield against the small cruelties she faced daily. But not everyone shared her reverence for Mrs. Eleanor's wisdom. Across the street, Mr. Finch watched Sarah's visits with growing frustration. He had begun digging into Mrs. Eleanor's past, driven by a mix of prejudice and paranoia. When a distant cousin of Mrs. Eleanor's appeared at a neighborhood event, Finch saw an opportunity. She's not as alone as she seems, Finch told the man, whose name was Gerald. I've heard she's got a considerable sum tucked away. Wouldn't it be a shame if the wrong people got their hands on it? Gerald, a man with a greedy glint in his eye, began asking questions, setting the stage for a future confrontation. One afternoon, Sarah arrived at Mrs. Eleanor's house to find the older woman unusually pale and lethargic. "I'm just a bit under the weather," Mrs. Eleanor assured her, but Sarah wasn't convinced. She rushed home to tell her parents, who insisted on taking Mrs. Eleanor to the doctor. At the clinic, tests revealed an underlying heart condition that required immediate attention. Marcus and Angela stepped in, caring for Mrs. Eleanor as if she were family. But their involvement fueled the neighborhood's growing suspicions. "They're just looking for a payday," one neighbor whispered. "Why else would they go to so much trouble?" The Jacksons ignored the gossip, focusing instead on Mrs. Eleanor's recovery. For Sarah, the time spent nursing her friend deepened their bond, but it also exposed the fragility of their world. While cleaning Mrs. Eleanor's house one day, Sarah stumbled upon a hidden compartment in her desk. Inside was a legal document, a will, signed and notarized, naming Sarah's family as the primary beneficiaries of Mrs. Eleanor's estate. Stunned, Sarah showed the document to her parents. Angela's reaction was immediate. "We can't accept this," she said, her voice trembling. "It'll only give people more reasons to hate us." But Marcus, ever pragmatic, saw it differently. "It's her choice. If this is how she wants to thank us, who are we to argue?" Sarah, caught between her parents' perspectives, turned to Mrs. Eleanor for answers. "Why us?" she asked. Mrs. Eleanor smiled, her face lined with affection. "Because you're the only ones who've treated me like family. Money means nothing if you've got no one to share it with." The news of Mrs. Eleanor's intentions spread quickly. Thanks to Mr. Finch and Gerald, the whispers turned into accusations. And soon, tensions in Harmony Haven boiled over. "Do you really think she's giving it all to them?" one neighbor asked at a community meeting. "It's suspicious, if you ask me," another chimed in. Gerald, emboldened by Mr. Finch's meddling, announced his intention to contest the will, claiming Mrs. Eleanor wasn't of sound mind. The stage was set for a battle that would test Sarah's family in ways they couldn't yet imagine. That night, a stone shattered one of the Jacksons' windows, landing in the living room with a loud crash. Tied to it was a note scrawled in the same harsh handwriting as before. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." Sarah clutched the silver key around her neck, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She looked at her parents, whose faces were etched with worry. "We're not going anywhere," Marcus said firmly, "not without a fight." And as the storm outside raged, Sarah realized that the battle for Mrs. Eleanor's legacy was only beginning. The morning air in Harmony Haven was crisp, but the atmosphere in the neighborhood was anything but calm. Whispers had turned into open chatter, and suspicion of the Jackson family rippled through every corner. Neighbors gathered at the local coffee shop, on porches, and at the small park to discuss what they now referred to as the situation. "I heard she's leaving them everything," Mrs. Tanner, a nosy neighbor, said over her morning latte. "Eleanor's too smart for that." Another retorted, "This has to be a misunderstanding." But Mr. Finch's voice rose above the murmurs, his words sharp and calculated. "There's no misunderstanding. They've manipulated her, plain and simple. Someone needs to step in." The conversations grew uglier with each retelling, fueled by envy, prejudice, and the subtle, deep-seated racism that Harmony Haven had long ignored. At home, the Jacksons tried to maintain their routine, but the pressure was palpable. Angela worked tirelessly to shield Sarah from the brunt of the backlash, while Marcus focused on keeping their business afloat amidst dwindling customers and pointed stares. Sarah, however, couldn't escape the tension. At school, classmates whispered behind her back, and one particularly cruel girl, Emma, made a loud remark in the cafeteria. "Guess we all know how your family's paying for that house now." Emma sneered, her voice dripping with venom. Sarah clenched her fists but stayed silent, her mother's warning ringing in her ears. "Don't give them a reason to think less of you." That evening, Sarah confided in Mrs. Eleanor. "Why are people so mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with frustration. Mrs. Eleanor placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Fear and ignorance, my dear. They're afraid of what they don't understand." Meanwhile, Mr. Finch was busy stirring the pot. He approached Gerald, Mrs. Eleanor's distant cousin, and proposed a plan. "If we work together, we can challenge her will. I've already consulted a lawyer," he said, his tone conspiratorial. Gerald hesitated. What if it's what Eleanor really wants? I haven't spoken to her in years. It's not about what she wants. Mr. Finch snapped. It's about what's fair. That money belongs to her blood relatives, not to some strangers who showed up out of nowhere. Gerald, enticed by the prospect of millions, finally agreed. Together, they began preparing to launch a legal challenge. One Saturday afternoon, as Sarah helped Mrs. Eleanor in her garden, Mr. Finch appeared at the gate. His presence was like a dark cloud. His face twisted with contempt. "Eleanor," he said, his tone falsely polite. "A word, if you don't mind." Mrs. Eleanor straightened, her usual warmth replaced by a steely resolve. "What do you want, Finch?" He glanced at Sarah, his gaze cold. "I think it's time we discussed your will. There are some people, family, mind you, who believe it's being unfairly influenced. That's none of your business," Mrs. Eleanor said firmly, her voice steady despite her frail appearance. "Oh, but it is," Finch replied. "You see, the rest of us care about this community. We don't want to see outsiders taking advantage of one of our own." Sarah bristled at the word outsiders, but Mrs. Eleanor held up a hand, silencing her. "You've said your piece, Finch. Now, kindly leave." As he turned to go, Finch looked directly at Sarah. "You're playing with fire, little girl. Be careful you don't get burned." Days later, the Jacksons received a formal notice. Gerald and Mr. Finch were contesting the will on the grounds that Mrs. Eleanor had been manipulated into changing it. The document accused the family of exploiting an elderly woman's kindness, a claim that infuriated Marcus and Angela. "This is ridiculous," Marcus exclaimed, slamming the notice onto the table. "We've done nothing but care for her." Angela's face was pale with worry. "But can we prove it? They'll use every dirty trick in the book." Sarah, sitting quietly with the silver key around her neck, finally spoke. "We have to fight for Mrs. Eleanor." The lawsuit divided the neighborhood. Some residents, like Mrs. Tanner, sided with Mr. Finch, citing community values. Others, particularly a younger couple who had seen the Jacksons' kindness firsthand, began speaking out in their defense. At school, Sarah found herself at the center of the conflict. Friends she thought she had made began avoiding her, while others teased her openly. One day, Emma confronted her again, this time in front of a crowd. "Bet you're already spending that money in your head," Emma sneered. Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "We didn't ask for any of this. Mrs. Eleanor chose us because we care about her." Emma rolled her eyes, but the murmurs around them seemed less certain. Amidst the turmoil, a surprising ally emerged, a retired lawyer named Mr. Halstead, who had known Mrs. Eleanor for years, approached the Jacksons. "I'm appalled by what's happening," he said. "Eleanor is sharp as a tack and fully capable of making her own decisions. If you'd like, I'll represent you pro bono." The Jacksons gratefully accepted his help, and Mr. Halstead began building their case. His strategy centered on proving Mrs. Eleanor's mental competence and the genuine bond she shared with the Jacksons. As the first court hearing approached, Sarah visited Mrs. Eleanor, who was sitting on the porch, looking out at the sunset. "Are you scared?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Mrs. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Not scared, angry, but I fought harder battles than this." Sarah nodded, drawing strength from her mentor's resilience. But as she left that evening, she noticed a car parked down the street, its engine idling. Inside, a shadowy figure watched her until she disappeared into her house. The Jacksons were ready to fight for Mrs. Eleanor's legacy, but it was clear their opponents were willing to go to any lengths to win. The courtroom was packed, the air buzzing with tension. Sarah sat between her parents, her hands clasped tightly together. On the other side of the room, Gerald sat with his lawyer, a smug look plastered on his face. Next to him was Mr. Finch, his steely gaze fixed on the Jacksons. At the front of the room, Mrs. Eleanor sat in a wheelchair, her face calm but resolute. Her lawyer, Mr. Halstead, stood beside her, his legal pad filled with notes. The judge, a stern woman with sharp features, entered, and the room fell silent. "This hearing is to address the contestation of Mrs. Eleanor Williams's will," the judge announced. "Let's proceed." Gerald's lawyer began with a carefully crafted statement, painting the Jacksons as opportunists who had taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman. He produced photographs of Sarah visiting Mrs. Eleanor's home, emphasizing the frequency of her visits. "Mrs. Williams, would you say you've been influenced by this family?" the lawyer asked. his tone dripping with condescension. Mrs. Eleanor straightened in her wheelchair. I'm influenced by kindness, if that's what you mean. The Jacksons have treated me with more respect and care than anyone else in this neighborhood. The room murmured, and Sarah felt a surge of pride. But the lawyer wasn't done. He shifted tactics, questioning Mrs. Eleanor's mental fitness and subtly suggesting that her age made her susceptible to manipulation. Do you believe you're of sound mind, Mrs. Williams? The lawyer asked. Mrs. Eleanor's sharp laugh cut through the tension. Are you asking if I know my own name? It's Eleanor Margaret Williams, born May 14, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. My mother's name was Rose. My father's James. My husband, God rest his soul, was Richard Williams. I've handled business deals more complicated than this nonsense. So yes, I'd say my mind is sound. The courtroom erupted in soft chuckles, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The lawyer's face reddened, but he moved on, introducing Gerald as a blood relative with a rightful claim to the estate. When it was Mr. Halstead's turn, he approached the stand with quiet confidence. He presented evidence of Mrs. Eleanor's long-standing independence, including her medical records and testimony from her doctors affirming her mental acuity. He then introduced the Jacksons as witnesses, beginning with Angela. Mrs. Jackson, can you describe your relationship with Mrs. Williams? Angela, her voice steady despite the pressure, detailed how their family had cared for Mrs. Eleanor through her illness, often at great personal sacrifice. We never did it for money, she concluded. We did it because we love her. Finally, Sarah took the stand. Her small figure seemed dwarfed by the imposing courtroom, but her voice was clear. Mrs. Eleanor isn't just my neighbor. She's my friend. She taught me how to garden, how to be strong, and how to never let anyone make me feel small. Her words hung in the air, moving several spectators to tears. As the hearing neared its end, Mr. Halstead called an unexpected witness, Mrs. Eleanor's former business associate, Mr. Bennett, who had traveled from Chicago to testify. Mrs. Williams was one of the sharpest, most ethical people I ever worked with, Bennett said. She doesn't make decisions lightly. If she chose the Jacksons, you can bet it wasn't on a whim. This testimony further solidified the Jacksons' case, leaving Gerald and Mr. Finch visibly rattled. During a recess, Gerald confronted Mrs. Eleanor in the hallway. Why them, Aunt Eleanor? Why not your family? Mrs. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Family isn't about blood, Gerald. It's about who shows up. Who cares? And you? You've only shown up for the money. Gerald flushed with anger but said nothing. Storming back into the courtroom, Finch, watching from a distance, made a note on a pad of paper, his expression unreadable. The hearing concluded after several days of emotional testimony and sharp legal arguments. The judge, after deliberating, returned with her ruling. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, it is clear that Mrs. Eleanor Williams is fully competent to make decisions regarding her estate. Her will, as it stands, is valid and enforceable. The contestation is dismissed. Relief washed over the Jacksons, and Sarah hugged her parents tightly. But the victory was bittersweet. The tension in the neighborhood remained, and Mr. Finch's dark expression suggested he wasn't done causing trouble. News of the ruling spread quickly. Supporters of the Jacksons congratulated them, while others, led by Mr. Finch, continued to sow discord. Gerald left town in disgrace, but not before selling his story to a local tabloid, further fueling the neighborhood's divisions. Sarah tried to focus on the positives. Mrs. Eleanor was thrilled with the outcome and began planning ways to use her remaining years and wealth to make a difference. She spoke of turning her home into a community garden or funding scholarships for underprivileged youth. One evening, as Sarah walked home from Mrs. Eleanor's, she noticed a figure lingering near her driveway. The man was tall, his features obscured by the dim light. When he noticed Sarah watching, he quickly disappeared into the shadows. Later that night, a brick smashed through the Jacksons' living room window. Tied to it was a note that read, "This isn't over." As Marcus dialed the police, Angela pulled Sarah close, her face pale with fear. Sarah clutched the silver key around her neck, its weight both comforting and ominous. Whatever lay ahead, she knew their fight was far from over. The shattered glass still crunched underfoot as Marcus cleaned up the remnants of the brick that had been hurled through their window. Angela sat on the couch, holding Sarah close while trying to maintain her composure. Outside, The flashing lights of a police car cast eerie shadows against the walls. "We're escalating security," Marcus said firmly after the police had taken their report. "And no one is walking home alone anymore." Sarah nodded silently, her fingers absent-mindedly touching the key around her neck. She felt the weight of the tension growing heavier. Not just in their home but in the neighborhood itself. Whispers and glares were now outright hostility, fueled by jealousy and Mr. Finch's vendetta. Mr. Finch, undeterred by the judge's dismissal of the will contestation, sought a different angle. He began spreading rumors that the Jacksons had coerced Mrs. Eleanor into signing the will through psychological manipulation. His accusations gained traction among certain neighbors, emboldened by the anonymous articles Gerald had published. Finch's lawyer filed an appeal, requesting a new hearing based on these claims. Though flimsy, the motion threatened to drag the Jacksons back into court and further exhaust their resources. "We're not giving up," Marcus told Angela as he reviewed the legal documents with Mr. Halstead. "They want to scare us into backing down. But we've come too far." While tensions rose, a surprising visitor arrived at the Jacksons' home one evening. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Eleanor's former business partner, had extended his stay in town to support them. "I can't stand by and watch this," Bennett said. "Eleanor's been through enough, and so have you. Finch is dangerous, but he's not invincible." Bennett offered to provide additional resources for their legal fight, including hiring a private investigator to uncover any dirt on Mr. Finch that could discredit his appeal. Though wary, the Jacksons agreed. Desperate times called for bold measures. The private investigator's work uncovered shocking details about Mr. Finch's past. Finch had once worked as an estate manager for an elderly couple, only to be dismissed under allegations of fraud, though the charges had been quietly dropped. The case hinted at his potential for manipulation and dishonesty. The investigator also uncovered evidence of Finch pressuring Gerald to file the initial contestation, offering him a portion of the estate if they succeeded. "These findings are explosive," Mr. Halstead said during a meeting with the Jacksons. "If we play this right, Finch won't have a leg to stand on." As the new hearing approached, Finch's actions became more brazen. Flyers appeared on neighborhood doors, accusing the Jacksons of exploiting Mrs. Eleanor. Anonymous letters were sent to their grocery store's customers, causing a noticeable drop in business. Sarah, now the target of cruel pranks at school, found herself retreating into silence. One day, as she sat in the library during lunch, Mrs. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind, "Never let anyone dim your light." Her resolve hardened. She began wearing the silver key openly, a quiet statement of defiance. The appeal hearing was even more charged than the first. Finch's lawyer argued that Mrs. Eleanor's decision-making had been compromised by undue influence. The Jacksons' legal team countered with evidence of Finch's prior misconduct, presenting witnesses and documentation to support their claims. The most damning moment came when Bennett testified about Finch's role in Gerald's challenge. "He's manipulating the situation for his own gain, just as he's done before," Bennett stated, his voice firm. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Finch's smug demeanor cracked under the weight of the revelations. At Mr. Halstead's request, Sarah once again took the stand. This time, her testimony was different, not just a recounting of her relationship with Mrs. Eleanor, but a direct challenge to those who doubted her family's intentions. "Mrs. Eleanor has taught me more about kindness and strength than anyone I've ever known," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "She's not just my neighbor, she's my family. And we will fight for her the way she's fought for us." Her words hung in the air, leaving an indelible impression on everyone in the room. Just as the hearing was nearing its conclusion, a surprise witness came forward, an elderly woman named Clara, who had known Finch from his previous job as an estate manager. Clara recounted how Finch had ingratiated himself with her late employer, only to exploit their trust for personal gain. Her testimony was devastating. Finch's lawyer tried to discredit her, but her story was corroborated by documentation from the private investigator. As Clara left the stand, Finch's confidence crumbled. He avoided eye contact with anyone, his facade of control shattered. After days of testimony and arguments, the judge delivered her ruling. The appeal was denied, and the original decision upheld. The judge admonished Finch for his actions, hinting at potential consequences if further accusations were made without evidence. The Jacksons embraced, their relief palpable. Sarah looked over at Mrs. Eleanor, who gave her a small, proud nod. While the courtroom battle was over, the neighborhood remained tense. Some residents apologized for doubting the Jacksons, while others, including Finch's closest allies, refused to acknowledge their victory. Finch, now disgraced, sold his home and left Harmony Haven. His departure was a small victory, but the scars he left behind were deep. That evening, the Jacksons and Mrs. Eleanor celebrated quietly at home. Over a simple dinner, they spoke of the future. Mrs. Eleanor outlined her plans to turn her estate into a community center, a place where children like Sarah could find support and encouragement. "You've been my light in dark times, Sarah," Mrs. Eleanor said. "Now it's my turn to shine that light on others." Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of the silver key around her neck. The battle had been long and grueling, but it had also revealed the strength of their bond, and the power of standing up for what was right. The days following Mr. Finch's departure brought a tentative peace to Harmony Haven. While some neighbors tried to move past the conflict, others avoided the Jacksons altogether. For Sarah, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet, beneath the surface, she sensed that something unresolved lingered, something tied to Mrs. Eleanor's past. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor called Sarah to her house. "I think it's time you knew everything," she said, leading her into the study. Mrs. Eleanor placed a worn leather journal on the desk, its pages thick with handwritten notes and newspaper clippings. "This," she said, "is the story of my life, the parts one don't often share." Sarah listened intently as Mrs. Eleanor recounted her rise in Chicago's grain industry. The journal detailed her innovative business strategies and the systemic racism she faced. But it also revealed something darker, a betrayal by a man named Victor Mallory, who had been both a business partner and a close friend. "Victor was the one who ruined me," Mrs. Eleanor said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "He stole my company's proprietary methods and left me on the brink of bankruptcy. I fled to Harmony Haven to escape the humiliation." Sarah's eyes widened as she flipped through the journal. One clipping, a photo of a young Mrs. Eleanor at a corporate event, caught her attention. Standing beside her was a man with a familiar face. "Wait, is this?" Sarah trailed off, unable to believe her eyes. The man in the photo bore an uncanny resemblance to Mr. Finch. "Yes," Mrs. Eleanor said grimly. Victor Mallory changed his name to Thomas Finch. The revelation sent shockwaves through Sarah. Everything made sense now. Finch's obsession with discrediting Mrs. Eleanor, his manipulative tactics, and his willingness to go to such great lengths to contest the will. "He was trying to destroy you again," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Even after all these years?" Mrs. Eleanor nodded. "He couldn't stand the thought of me rebuilding what he tore down. And when he saw your family helping me, he saw another opportunity to ruin me." Armed with the knowledge of Finch's true identity, the Jacksons and Mr. Halstead began exploring their legal options. The investigator unearthed additional evidence linking Finch to fraudulent activities in other states under different aliases. With Mrs. Eleanor's permission, the story was shared with local media. The headlines were explosive. "Former business mogul speaks out. The betrayal that changed everything." The revelation shifted public opinion in Harmony Haven. Neighbors who had been skeptical of the Jacksons began rallying around them, offering support and apologies. Sarah, once ostracized at school, found herself at the center of attention. The media coverage brought Finch out of hiding. Now cornered, he issued a statement denying the allegations. But his words carried little weight against the mounting evidence. Authorities opened an investigation into his fraudulent activities, and soon, warrants were issued for his arrest. Sarah watched the news with a mix of relief and satisfaction. "He won't hurt anyone else now," she said quietly. Mrs. Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder. "Justice doesn't erase the pain, Sarah, but it does bring closure." With the conflict behind them, Mrs. Eleanor turned her attention to her legacy. She finalized plans to transform her home into a community resource center. The space would include a library, a tutoring program, and a garden for teaching sustainability. Sarah eagerly helped with the preparations, her excitement contagious. "We should name the library after you," she suggested one afternoon. Mrs. Eleanor laughed. "How about we name it after both of us? Eleanor and Sarah's Learning Haven." Sarah's smile lit up the room. "I'd love that." The grand opening of the community center was a joyful event. Families from all over Harmony Haven attended, marveling at the transformation of Mrs. Eleanor's home. Marcus and Angela were beaming with pride. And Sarah was the star of the day, sharing stories about Mrs. Eleanor's vision and their shared journey. As Sarah stood at the podium to give a speech, she touched the silver key around her neck. "This key isn't just a gift," she said, her voice strong. "It's a symbol of what's possible when we open doors for each other." The crowd erupted in applause, and Mrs. Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Sarah and Mrs. Eleanor sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. The community center buzzed with laughter and conversation in the background. "You've come a long way, Sarah," Mrs. Eleanor said softly. "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, leaning her head against the older woman's shoulder. The air was filled with a sense of renewal. The battles they had fought weren't forgotten, but they had forged something stronger, a bond, a purpose, and a legacy that would endure long after the shadows of the past had faded. The sun rose over Harmony Haven, but the air in the neighborhood remained heavy with tension. While some residents congratulated the Jacksons on their courtroom victory, others maintained their distance, their prejudice too ingrained to let go. Flyers with inflammatory messages about the Jacksons still appeared sporadically, though now anonymously. Sarah, walking to Mrs. Eleanor's house, noticed the new quiet in the neighborhood. Mr. Finch's departure had left a void, but it was filled with lingering distrust and unresolved tensions. Her hand brushed the silver key around her neck as she approached Mrs. Eleanor's door, determined to focus on the good they were creating despite the challenges. Inside, Mrs. Eleanor greeted Sarah with a warm smile, but her expression held a hint of seriousness. She gestured for Sarah to sit at the dining table, where an old, leather-bound journal lay. "Sarah," Mrs. Eleanor began, "there's something I've been meaning to share with you. Something from my past that might help you understand why I fought so hard for this life, and for you." Sarah nodded, her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Eleanor opened the journal, revealing pages filled with meticulous notes, letters, and photographs. "This is my life story," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The good, the bad, and the battles I've fought to get here." As Sarah flipped through the pages, she uncovered details about Mrs. Eleanor's life in Chicago, her rise as a trailblazing businesswoman in a male-dominated industry, her battles against systemic racism, and the betrayal by her former business partner. One photograph showed a young Eleanor standing outside her company's headquarters, a look of fierce determination in her eyes. "This journal is more than memories," Mrs. Eleanor explained. "It's evidence, evidence of what I endured, what I overcame, and now, it's yours." Sarah looked up, startled. "Mine?" Mrs. Eleanor nodded. "You're the future, Sarah. You have the strength to carry this forward, to inspire others to fight for what's right." As Sarah continued reading, she came across a letter tucked into one of the journal's pages. It was dated decades earlier, written in the same bold handwriting as the letters she had found in the attic. "This doesn't look like the others," Sarah said, holding up the letter. Mrs. Eleanor's face darkened as she recognized it. "That," she said slowly, "is from the man who betrayed me, Gerald's father." The letter detailed how Gerald's father had conspired to defraud Mrs. Eleanor's company, using forged documents to transfer her business assets to himself. It also implicated Finch, who had been a minor accomplice in the scheme at the time. Sarah's eyes widened. "This is proof that Finch and Gerald's family have been lying all along." Mrs. Eleanor nodded grimly. "But it's also a reminder of how far people will go when they're driven by greed." That evening, Sarah shared the discovery with her parents and Mr. Halstead. Marcus and Angela were initially hesitant to use the letter, wary of escalating the conflict further. But Sarah was resolute. "They tried to destroy Mrs. Eleanor's legacy," Sarah said. "We can't let them get away with it." Mr. Halstead agreed. "This could be the leverage we need to not only clear your family's name but also ensure that no one tries to contest her will again." The Jacksons and Mrs. Eleanor decided to hold a community meeting, inviting all the residents of Harmony Haven. They framed it as an opportunity to address the lingering tensions and foster unity. But they also planned to reveal the truth about Finch and Gerald's family. The community center was packed that evening, the air thick with anticipation. Mrs. Eleanor spoke first, recounting her journey and the reasons she had chosen the Jacksons as her beneficiaries. Then, Sarah stepped forward, holding up the incriminating letter. "This is a letter written by Gerald's father," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. "It proves that the lies they told about us were part of a pattern of greed and betrayal that started long before we came here." The room erupted in whispers, and Gerald's former allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The evidence was undeniable, and for the first time, the tide of opinion began to turn in the Jacksons' favor. One of the most vocal critics of the Jacksons, Mrs. Tanner, stood up. "I'll admit, I was wrong about you," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. But this changes everything." Her words sparked a ripple effect, with other neighbors expressing similar sentiments. The Jacksons, once isolated, began to see glimmers of acceptance. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of hope. Mrs. Eleanor's dream of turning her home into a community center gained momentum. With neighbors volunteering to help, the Jacksons, though still cautious, felt the weight of hostility begin to lift. As Sarah walked home that night, she looked up at the stars, feeling the silver key around her neck. It was more than a symbol now, it was a reminder of the battles they had fought and the strength they had found in each other. But just as Sarah began to feel a sense of peace, a car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a man she didn't recognize. "You've stirred up a lot of trouble, kid," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Be careful where you stick your nose." The car sped off, leaving Sarah standing in the street, her heart pounding. She hurried home, realizing that while the community might be healing, the fight was far from over. Harmony Haven buzzed with a cautious optimism. The community center project, spearheaded by Mrs. Eleanor and supported by the Jacksons, began taking shape. Volunteers, inspired by the recent revelations, came forward to clean, renovate, and plan activities for the space. It was a collective effort that brought the neighborhood together, at least on the surface. Sarah, now a central figure in the project, spent her afternoons painting walls, organizing books for the center's library, and brainstorming programs to support local families. Her silver key became a symbol of the center's mission, prominently featured in the center's logo, a stylized key unlocking a vibrant community. Despite the progress, not everyone was supportive. Flyers criticizing the community center as a waste of resources began appearing on telephone poles, and donations for the project stalled. Sarah and her parents suspected lingering resentment from those loyal to Mr. Finch and Gerald's smear campaign. Angela confronted Sarah one evening as they worked late at the center. "You've done so much already," she said, "but maybe it's time to take a step back. Let others lead." Sarah shook her head, her determination unwavering. "This isn't just about the center, Mom. It's about showing people that good things can come out of all this." Mr. Bennett returned to Harmony Haven with a significant announcement. "I've spoken to some old colleagues in Chicago," he told Mrs. Eleanor and the Jacksons. "They're impressed by what you're building here. They've agreed to fund the project, on one condition." The condition was simple. The community center had to implement a mentorship program for disadvantaged youth, modeled after initiatives Mrs. Eleanor had supported in her business career. The Jacksons eagerly agreed, and with the funding secured, the project gained new momentum. As the center neared completion, old tensions flared. A group of residents, led by a man named Mr. Caldwell, petitioned the city to block the center's opening, claiming it would increase traffic and disrupt the neighborhood's character. The Jacksons and their allies organized a counter-petition, gathering signatures from supportive residents. Sarah, though nervous, took the lead in speaking at a town hall meeting to address the concerns. "The center isn't just a building," Sarah said, her voice steady but impassioned. "It's a place for kids like me, kids who need a safe space to grow, learn, and dream. Isn't that worth a little extra traffic?" Her words moved many in attendance, though Caldwell and his group remained steadfast in their opposition. Amid the efforts to gain city approval, a shocking betrayal rocked the Jacksons. One of the volunteers, a neighbor who had seemed supportive, leaked internal plans for the center to a local news outlet with a sensationalized headline: "Harmony Haven's new center, charity or chaos?" The article reignited doubts about the Jacksons' intentions, painting them as self-serving opportunists. The backlash threatened to derail the project just weeks before its grand opening. In a surprising turn, some of the neighborhood's quieter residents stepped forward to defend the center. Mrs. Tanner, once a skeptic, wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper, praising the Jacksons and the work being done. Others followed suit, flooding the paper with letters of support. Social media campaigns sprang up, showcasing the positive impact the center was already having. Even before its doors officially opened, the grand opening of the Eleanor Williams Community Center was both a celebration and a triumph. The event drew families from across the city, as well as local officials and donors. Mrs. Eleanor, dressed in her finest, cut the ribbon with Sarah by her side. Inside, the center was alive with activity, children exploring the new library, parents signing up for workshops, and volunteers discussing plans for the mentorship program. "This is what I dreamed of," Mrs. Eleanor said, her eyes glistening. "A place where everyone feels they belong." As the event wound down, Sarah noticed the same car from weeks earlier idling near the center. The driver, the same man who had warned her before, made no attempt to approach. Instead, he simply watched, his expression unreadable. Before driving off, when Sarah mentioned the incident to her parents, Marcus's face darkened. "We need to stay vigilant," he said. "This isn't over." That evening, Sarah sat with Mrs. Eleanor on the porch of her home. The silver key around her neck glinted in the moonlight. "You've done something extraordinary, Sarah," Mrs. Eleanor said. "This place, this community, it's stronger because of you." Sarah smiled but felt a pang of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that their fight wasn't over. Still, she resolved to savor the victory, knowing they had already accomplished so much. As Sarah walked home, she felt the weight of the silver key once more. It was a symbol of hope and resilience, but also a reminder of the challenges still ahead. The shadows of Harmony Haven stretched long behind her, and she knew the road forward would not be easy. But Sarah also knew this: whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and determination that had brought them this far. The Eleanor Williams Community Center bustled with activity just days after its grand opening. Families from across Harmony Haven and neighboring communities visited daily, drawn by its programs, after-school tutoring, gardening workshops, and a mentorship initiative for underprivileged youth. Sarah stood at the entrance, watching children run excitedly into the library. She smiled, the silver key around her neck catching the sunlight. The center was thriving, but a nagging unease lingered. The man in the car, the anonymous letters, these shadows hadn't disappeared. As the Jacksons celebrated the center's early success, a new wave of anonymous threats began arriving. This time, they targeted not just the family but the center itself. One letter read, "Close your doors, or you'll regret it. Some things don't belong in this neighborhood." Marcus reported the threats to the police, but they could do little without concrete evidence. The family installed additional security cameras and ensured volunteers at the center were vigilant. Sarah, however, refused to let the threats intimidate her. "This place is bigger than their hate," she told her parents. "We won't stop." One evening, as Marcus and Sarah were locking up the center, they discovered broken glass scattered near the front doors. A rock, thrown through one of the windows, lay on the floor. Attached to it was a note that read, "Your time is running out." The incident shook the family, but it also galvanized the community. Volunteers and neighbors showed up the next morning to help repair the damage. A visible stand against the intimidation tactics. "We're not letting them win," one neighbor said as she swept up the broken glass. The center, it seemed, had already become a symbol of resilience. A few days later, the man from the car finally approached Sarah as she walked home from school. His appearance was unremarkable, mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a plain jacket, but his demeanor was tense. "You're Sarah, right?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah hesitated, gripping her backpack strap tightly. "Who's asking? I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly, glancing over his shoulder. "But you need to know something. The people who've been threatening your family, they're not just angry neighbors. They're part of something bigger." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "Read this, but be careful who you show it to." Before Sarah could ask more, he walked away, disappearing around the corner. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The note detailed a loosely organized group operating in the area, focused on maintaining traditional values and opposing efforts to integrate neighborhoods like Harmony Haven. The group had targeted the Jacksons and the community center as a perceived threat to their ideals. Sarah showed the letter to her parents and Mr. Halstead. "This isn't just about us," she said. "They're trying to stop everything the center stands for." Mr. Halstead nodded gravely. "This is serious, but it also gives us leverage. If we expose them, we could turn public opinion against them entirely." With Mr. Bennett's help, the Jacksons and Mrs. Eleanor coordinated a plan to address the threats head-on. They organized a press conference at the community center, inviting local journalists and city officials. The goal was twofold: to highlight the center's positive impact and to shine a light on the shadowy group working to undermine it. On the day of the press conference, the center was filled with supporters. Mrs. Eleanor, despite her frail health, delivered a powerful speech. "This center is not just a building," she said. "It's a beacon for everyone who has ever felt unwelcome, unworthy, or unseen, and no amount of hatred will extinguish that light." The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive, and city officials pledged increased support for the center. The threats, however, did not stop. One night, as Marcus was closing up the center, he noticed a car idling nearby. He stepped outside, intending to confront the driver. But before he could reach the car, the driver sped off, nearly hitting him in the process. The incident alarmed the family, prompting them to increase security measures yet again. Sarah, though shaken, refused to back down. "They're trying to scare us," she said, "but we're stronger than they think." Despite the continued threats, the community center's programs flourished. More families joined, volunteers expanded their efforts, and donations poured in from across the city. The mentorship program, in particular, gained attention for its success stories, with several students crediting it for turning their lives around. One day, Sarah received a letter from a young girl who had attended a summer workshop at the center. The girl wrote about how the center had given her a sense of purpose and belonging, inspiring her to pursue a dream of becoming a teacher. Sarah read the letter aloud to Mrs. Eleanor, who smiled through tears. "This," Mrs. Eleanor said, "is why we fight." The private investigator hired by Mr. Bennett uncovered the identities of the key members behind the threats. Among them were two prominent figures in the neighborhood, including Mr. Caldwell, who had opposed the center from the start. Armed with this information, Mr. Halstead helped the Jacksons file a formal complaint with the city and law enforcement. The revelations sent shockwaves through Harmony Haven, exposing the deep-seated prejudice that had fueled the campaign against the center. Caldwell and his associates faced public condemnation and legal consequences, effectively neutralizing the group's influence. As the dust began to settle, the Jacksons and Mrs. Eleanor reflected on how far they had come. The community center stood as a testament to their resilience, its walls filled with laughter, learning, and hope. One evening, Sarah sat on the steps of the center, the silver key in her hand. She thought about the battles they had fought and the lives they had touched. "We did it," she whispered, a quiet smile spreading across her face. But as she looked toward the horizon, she knew the journey wasn't over. The center was just the beginning, a ripple of hope in a world that still needed change.